I never imagined that 5 years under my stepfather's control would leave scars I am still trying to hide today, yet as I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror that evening, trembling after another sudden panic attack, I realized how deeply those years had carved themselves into every part of me. My reflection looked familiar, but distant, like someone I used to know before. Fear replaced my confidence, and before silence became the only language I felt safe speaking. The faint bruise along my collarbone had already faded to a soft yellow, but the memory of how it got there pulsed beneath my skin like an old injury that refused to heal. Even when the marks disappeared, the echo of his voice, the weight of his footsteps, and the sharp tension in the air whenever he grew angry stayed with me as if I were still trapped in that house. That night, as I gripped the edge of the sink to steady my breathing, I understood why survivors often say the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. I closed my eyes and whispered the word that had ultimately changed everything for me. The word that had given me strength on the night everything finally broke. Enough. The moment I said it, truly said it, the world shifted beneath my feet, and I felt something inside me wake up after being buried for years. I had rehearsed that word in my mind for so long, but never dared to release it into the air until the night Raymond pushed me too far. The memory of that night flashed behind my eyelids with painful clarity. The sound of a slammed door, the look in his eyes, the sudden certainty that if I stayed quiet one more time, I might never escape. The night I fought back is something I will never forget, not because I became fearless, but because I realized just how terrified I had been. It was the night I stopped shrinking myself to fit the boundaries he set. It was the night I stopped believing that I deserved the life he forced me to live. Even now, years later, my chest tightens when I hear a heavy footstep behind me or when someone raises their voice without warning. Healing has been slow, uneven, and often painful because the damage he caused did not vanish when I walked out the front door. My stepfather was not a monster in the beginning, not someone who revealed his cruelty all at once. He took control piece by piece until I could barely recognize the girl I used to be. And though I survived him, the scars he left still follow me in ways I do not always expect. Sometimes it is a dream that wakes me up shaking. Sometimes it is a shadow moving across a hallway that makes my heart race. And sometimes it is the quiet moments when I feel peace that frighten me the most because they remind me how rare peace used to be. I wish I could say that leaving ended the fear, but the truth is more complicated, especially for someone who spent so long convincing herself that she was the problem instead of the victim. People often wonder why someone stays in a situation like mine for so many years. They imagine it must be simple to walk away. They do not understand how much strength it takes to leave when the person hurting you has spent years shaping your world to make escape feel impossible. They do not understand how shame keeps you silent, how hope tricks you into believing things might get better, and how fear teaches you that speaking up will only make everything worse. For 5 years, I lived with those beliefs until the night I finally stood up. 5 years of excuses, whispered apologies, and promises from him that never meant anything. 5 years of watching my mother fade under his control. 5 years of wishing someone would notice the signs I worked so hard to hide. I know many people watching this will understand that kind of exhaustion, the quiet despair that settles in when you feel trapped in your own home. And before I go any further, I want to ask something I always ask when I share pieces of my story. Tell me where you are watching from and whether any part of this beginning feels familiar to you, because I have learned that the stories we carry are often much heavier when we carry them alone. When I finally escaped, I learned that countless others had lived through their own versions of my nightmare. Some were still trapped, some had just begun to heal, and some were still trying to understand how their pain had become part of their daily lives. My story is only one among many, but it is mine, and it is time I tell it from the beginning. There is a reason I want to take you back, a reason I want you to see how everything began long before the night I ran out of that house. Because my stepfather did not become the man who nearly broke me overnight. He became that man slowly, quietly, and with a level of control that felt almost invisible at first. But before I tell you how I escaped, you need to know how he became the man who nearly broke me. I grew up in Salem, Oregon, in a quiet middle-class neighborhood where the maple trees lined the streets so perfectly that every autumn felt like living inside a postcard, and where people greeted each other at grocery stores as if they had known one another for decades, even when they had not. For most of my childhood life felt stable in a gentle, steady way that let me believe the world was safe and predictable. My mother, Linda Carter, worked long shifts as a nurse at Willamette Valley Medical Center, and although her hours were demanding, she always made sure to be home in time to help me with homework or have dinner ready by the time I walked through the door after school. She was the kind of woman who smiled through exhaustion, who braided my hair before her night shifts, and who hummed old country songs while folding laundry like she had no worries at all. My father had passed away when I was 13 after a sudden heart attack that none of us saw coming, and the grief that entered our home felt like an unexpected winter, a season that stretched on far longer than anyone wished for. Losing him at such a young age left a hole in our family and in my understanding of what men were supposed to be. He had been gentle, thoughtful, and dependable, the kind of man who built birdhouses on weekends and left notes in my lunchbox when I had a difficult day at school. When he was gone, the house felt quieter, hollower somehow, but my mother did everything she could to keep the warmth alive. We survived those first years after his death by leaning on each other, sharing quiet dinners, paying bills with careful precision, and telling ourselves that life would eventually feel normal again. Slowly, little pieces of normalcy began to return as I moved through high school, focusing on my classes and volunteering at the community dental clinic, which became the place where I first discovered my interest in oral health. The clinic was small but busy, and the staff treated me like I mattered. For the first time after my father's passing, I felt like I had something to contribute, something that brought me joy. My mother encouraged that interest wholeheartedly, saying the world would always need good people in healthcare, and I believed her. When I was 16, my mother met a man named Raymond Hale at a church volunteer event, and I remember the first time she introduced him to me in our living room. He wore a pressed button-up shirt and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being listened to. His smile seemed warm enough, though something in his eyes made me tilt my head slightly uncertain, though I could not explain why. My mother, however, looked happier than I had seen her in years, and that alone made me try to ignore any hesitation. In the beginning, Raymond appeared almost perfect, the kind of man who held doors open, offered to fix the squeaky kitchen cabinet, and always complimented my mother's cooking, even when she burned the chicken or over-seasoned the potatoes. He brought flowers to the house every Sunday, bought my mother small thoughtful gifts, and asked me questions about school and my plans for the future. On the surface, he seemed like the answer to the loneliness that had followed us since my father died, and I will admit that a part of me wanted to believe that life had finally given my mother something good again. When they married 2 years later, I stood beside my mother in a pale blue bridesmaid dress, believing that maybe this was our chance at a fresh start. I was 16, hopeful, and trying my best to ignore the faint whisper in my mind that warned me things that appear perfect too quickly often carry shadows you cannot see yet. Raymond moved into our home right after the wedding, and at first, nothing felt out of place. He mowed the lawn on weekends, picked up groceries after work, and chatted with neighbors as though he had lived among them for years. People around town spoke highly of him, describing him as polite, hard-working, committed to his community. He held a steady job in warehouse logistics, and my mother said his consistency brought her comfort. For a brief period, it seemed like our life was settling into a promising rhythm, the kind that made me think maybe everything painful we had been through had finally led us somewhere brighter. But even in those early months, I noticed small moments that made me uneasy, moments so subtle that I questioned whether I imagined them. Sometimes I caught him watching me with an expression I could not decipher, not inappropriate, but unsettling in its intensity, an expression that made me want to look away before I fully understood what it meant. Sometimes he corrected my mother with a tone that seemed too sharp for the situation, or dismissed her opinions as if they were trivial. When he spoke about responsibility or discipline, his voice carried a firmness that felt out of place in casual conversation, and he had a way of turning small disagreements into lectures that lasted far too long. Still, my mother seemed content, and after years of grief, I wanted her happiness more than anything. So, whenever doubts crept into my mind, I swallowed them quietly. telling myself that surviving loss had simply made me overly cautious, that I needed to let good things unfold without trying to find problems where none existed. Everything was too good to be true, but at 16, I did not yet understand how dangerous that phrase could be. Looking back, I realized that he had begun shaping the house long before his real intentions emerged, but at the time, I had no idea that the man smiling in our family photographs would become the man who stole 5 years of my life. In the first months after Raymond moved into our home, life settled into a pattern that at first seemed harmless. Ordinary, even though every now and then something subtle in his behavior made a small chill crawl up my spine. He never raised his voice in those early days, never slammed a door, or showed anger in ways that anyone would immediately recognize as threatening. Instead, he made small comments that sounded like advice on the surface, but carried a tone that made me feel as if I had disappointed him, as if I had somehow made a mistake without knowing what rule I had broken. He spoke to my mother in a similar way, sometimes correcting her softly but firmly, as if he were guiding her toward being a better version of herself. I convinced myself that maybe he was simply a man who valued order and routine, that perhaps this was just his way of adjusting to a new family. But as the weeks passed, these small comments began to shift into something sharper, something that pressed against the edges of my comfort until I found myself second-guessing everything I said or did around him. The first time I noticed his control taking shape was during dinner one evening when my mother asked me about college applications. I had always planned to go into dental hygiene after volunteering at the clinic in high school, and I felt excited about the programs I had been researching. Before I could finish explaining my plans, Raymond interrupted with a light laugh and said that dental work was a fine hobby, but that I should choose something more practical, something that would reflect better on the family. The room fell silent for a moment, and I watched my mother's face tighten with confusion, but she did not challenge him. I remember feeling my stomach sink as he went on to explain that a stable future required discipline and direction, and that young women often made the mistake of choosing careers that were too soft or too easily replaced. His words were framed as guidance, but the underlying message was clear. He did not respect my choices, and worse, he did not believe I should be the one making them. After that night, he began offering unsolicited advice about everything ranging from the friends I spent time with to the clothes I wore to the tone I used when speaking. If I laughed too loudly, he told me to lower my voice. If I texted a friend during dinner, he said it was rude and demanded I put my phone away. If I came home even 10 minutes later than expected, he wanted to know exactly where I had been and why I had not informed him earlier. He masked these demands behind phrases like a household needs structure or young people need guidance, but each new rule chipped away at a small piece of my autonomy. My mother tried to smooth things over whenever tension surfaced and often apologized on his behalf, even though the apologies were never hers to give. She reminded me that Raymond had lived alone for a long time and needed time to adjust. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that he was simply learning how to be part of a family again, and that any roughness in his behavior was temporary. The truth, however, was already beginning to take shape long before either of us understood it. By the time I turned 20, the rules had become so normal that I barely questioned them. Raymond expected to know my class schedule down to the minute, and he disapproved of any friend he classified as a bad influence, which included nearly anyone he had not met personally. He began checking in on me unexpectedly, showing up at the clinic where I worked after school, or insisting on driving me home, even when I had already made plans to ride with a friend. At first, he framed his concern as protection, but there was a possessiveness beneath it that I felt, even if I could not yet articulate it. He controlled access to the house too, placing a new lock on the basement door without explanation and moving items around in my room as if testing whether I would notice. When I confronted him about it, he simply smiled and said he was making sure everything in the house was safe, that a responsible man kept order in his home. It was around this time that my mother began to change too. She seemed more anxious, more careful with her words around him, watching his reactions the same way I did. She still tried to defend him, but the confidence in her voice grew thinner with every passing month. I started to understand the meaning behind her long pauses, the way she held her breath before responding to his statements. It was the same way I held mine. Still, I pushed aside every warning sign. I told myself that no one is perfect, that maybe I was being overly sensitive, that my mother deserved companionship after everything she had endured. And for a while, these excuses allowed me to ignore the truth taking root beneath the surface of our home. Over time, Raymond's control over me shifted from subtle suggestions to explicit rules. He wanted to know where I was at all times. He tracked the mileage on my car. He questioned every dollar I spent and insisted on reviewing my phone bills under the pretense of managing household finances. He scolded me for leaving lights on, for sleeping too late on weekends, for the friends I chose, for the tone of voice I used when I disagreed with him. And always the worst part was how calm he sounded while doing it, as if his authority was a natural fact of life, something I should accept without hesitation. Somewhere inside me, a quiet voice began to whisper that something was terribly wrong, but that voice had to fight through years of wanting to keep peace in the house, wanting to protect my mother, wanting to avoid conflict with a man who claimed his intentions were good. What I did not understand then was that Raymond had already begun rewriting the rules of our home, and he was doing it so slowly that by the time we realized the truth, we were already living inside the world he had built. The transformation was still subtle but unmistakable, and soon he would no longer bother hiding it at all. The shift from control to abuse did not happen in a single dramatic moment, but in a gradual tightening of invisible ropes that wrapped themselves around my daily life until I could barely breathe without wondering how Raymond would react. It began with comments that felt more like warnings than suggestions, and over time, those warnings became sharp enough to cut into my confidence. I remember one evening when my mother asked me a harmless question about work, and I answered with a tired sigh after a long shift. Raymond glanced up from his newspaper with a look that sent a cold tremor down my spine and said that sighing like that made me sound disrespectful. I apologized automatically, even though I had done nothing wrong. At the time, I did not understand why I reacted so quickly, but I would later realize that my body had already learned to fear the tone he used when he felt challenged. Verbal corrections turned into harsh criticisms delivered in low, controlled mutters that made my stomach knot. He found fault in everything from the way I walked into a room to the way I placed dishes in the sink. If I hesitated when answering a question, he called me ungrateful. If I disagreed with him, he accused me of provoking tension in the house. My mother tried to mediate at first, but each attempt only made him colder toward her, and eventually she stopped trying altogether. She began apologizing for me before I could even speak, as if anticipating that my presence alone might set him off. That change in her was the first sign that the house was no longer ours, but his. The night he punched a hole in the wall just inches from my head was the moment I realized how quickly words could turn into something more dangerous. It happened after I came home 15 minutes later than expected because my shift had run overtime. He stood in the doorway waiting, his jaw clenched so tightly that the vein in his neck pulsed beneath the skin. Before I could finish explaining, he stepped closer with a sudden burst of anger and slammed his fist into the drywall behind me. The sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. I froze, my back pressed against the wall, my breath trapped somewhere in my chest. He did not touch me that night, but the message was unmistakable. He did not need to lay a hand on me to show me how much power he held. After that incident, his temper became a shadow that followed me everywhere, a storm that could break open without warning. He began using silence as punishment, refusing to speak to me or my mother for hours until we whispered apologies for things we had not even done. Sometimes he demanded that we redo household chores because he claimed they were not done to his standard. Other times he accused us of trying to undermine him simply because we disagreed with a trivial decision. The house grew quieter and quieter as we learned to walk gently around his temper as if the floor beneath us were covered in glass. I remember one afternoon when I was eating a small bowl of cereal before work, and he told me that the sound of my spoon tapping the bowl was irritating him. When I tried to finish quickly, he reached over, snatched the bowl from my hands, and dumped it into the sink with unnecessary force, splashing milk onto the counter. He leaned down, stared directly into my face, and told me not to make noises that bothered him. I nodded and whispered an apology, though a part of me hated myself for saying it. My mother watched from the hallway, her eyes wide but helpless. That was when I first saw the fear in her expression match the fear in mine. The first time he slapped me was strangely quiet, almost anticlimactic, as if he had been preparing for that moment without me realizing it. I had misplaced the cordless phone, and he was looking for it with growing frustration. When I said I had last seen it near the living room, he turned to me with a calmness that felt wrong and sharp at the same time. "You never pay attention, Emily," he said before his hand cracked across my cheek in a fast, precise motion that left me stunned more by the coldness in his eyes than the pain itself. My mother cried out, but he silenced her with a warning glare. I stared at the floor, unable to process what had happened, and he walked away as if nothing had occurred. In the days that followed, he acted almost affectionate, asking if my cheek hurt, speaking to me with a gentleness that felt like mockery. That unsettling shift between cruelty and calmness became his most effective weapon. It kept me off balance, always hoping he might return to a kinder version of himself, and always blaming myself when he grew angry again. His control tightened in every direction. He monitored my phone usage, demanded I leave my bedroom door open whenever I was inside, and insisted that I tell him if I planned to go anywhere other than work or class. He criticized the clothes I chose, saying some were too revealing or too childish, depending on his mood. He even commented on my posture during meals, telling me to sit straight or stop fidgeting, as if my existence needed to be trimmed and reshaped according to his standards. My mother began withdrawing into herself, losing weight and losing sleep, which only made her more vulnerable to his manipulation. Her shoulders slumped more each week, and she often flinched at sudden noises. Once, she accidentally dropped a glass in the kitchen, and the moment it shattered, she covered her head with both hands as if expecting to be struck. Raymond called her dramatic and walked away without helping her clean up. I knelt beside her to pick up the pieces, and when our eyes met, I saw an exhaustion in her that scared me. She whispered, "I am fine," but the tremble in her voice said otherwise. I realized then that she was just as trapped as I was. The worst part of those early years was the constant sense of dread that lived in my body. I woke each morning wondering what version of him I would face. Would he be the calm, calculating observer, or the explosive man who could go from quiet to furious in seconds? I became hyper-aware of every sound in the house, listening for the shift in his footsteps the way someone might listen for approaching thunder. Even when I tried to study or rest, my mind was never truly still. I felt watched even in my own room, and sometimes I pressed my ear to the door, listening for the slightest sign that he might be standing outside. By the time I reached the 3rd year of living under his roof, the fear had settled into my bones, a constant ache that never fully went away. And yet I told myself over and over that things could still get better, that if I stayed quiet, if I tried harder, if I made myself smaller, he might change. But I would soon learn that abusers do not soften when you shrink. They only grow bolder. 5 years under Raymond's tightening control felt less like a stretch of time and more like an unraveling of my identity, a slow erosion that chipped away at who I used to be until I barely recognized the person staring back at me in the mirror. Those years did not pass in a blur, but in a series of heavy moments that pressed themselves into my memory with a weight I still feel today. The first year was confusion, the second was dread, the third was fear, the fourth was resignation, and the fifth became a strange mixture of numbness and desperation. Each year brought a new layer of control, a new rule, a new way for him to assert power over every corner of my life, until I felt like a visitor inside my own home. The financial control began subtly, with him insisting that all household expenses be monitored through a shared spreadsheet that he alone had access to. He said it was to help us stay organized, but in reality, it became a tool he used to question every purchase my mother or I made, no matter how small. He scrutinized grocery receipts and lectured us for buying brand name items instead of cheaper alternatives, even though he himself bought whatever he pleased without explanation. He demanded to see my pay stubs and insisted I contribute precise amounts toward household bills, even when I did not earn enough to cover everything he claimed I owed. When I tried to save money to eventually move out, he told me that independence was a selfish fantasy and that my duty was to help the family. He made me feel guilty for wanting a life outside the walls of that house, saying I was ungrateful for all the stability he provided. Before long, I found myself working extra shifts just to avoid financial arguments with him, which only gave him more opportunities to accuse me of being irresponsible for not being home more often. Social control followed close behind. He criticized every friend I had from high school, claiming they were immature or shallow, or that they encouraged me to make bad decisions. Slowly, I stopped inviting people over because I never knew how he might behave in front of them. He monitored my phone constantly, asking who I was texting and why. He demanded I hand it over whenever he asked, pretending it was about safety when it was actually about ownership. He once accused me of hiding something simply because I placed my phone face down on the table, which led to an hour-long interrogation about whether I had met someone he did not approve of. Eventually, I stopped communicating with most people altogether because trying to maintain friendships under his watchful eye became exhausting and risky. Emotional control became intertwined with everything else. He used guilt and shame like they were tools he was born knowing how to use. If I challenged him, he reminded me of all he had supposedly sacrificed to be part of our lives. If I cried, he accused me of being manipulative. If I expressed frustration, he told me I was unstable. He twisted my words until I doubted my own perception of events. I learned to measure every expression on his face, every breath he took, every pause before he spoke. Living in that house felt like living inside a minefield where one wrong step could spark a reaction I was not prepared for. My mind became a constant tangle of self-doubt and fear. Physical control came next. It was not always violent, but it was always intentional. He would stand too close when he talked to me, forcing me to lean back against counters or walls with nowhere to go. He blocked doorways when I tried to walk past him. He grabbed my wrist when he wanted my attention, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to remind me he was stronger. His anger sometimes erupted in sudden movements, slamming cabinets or punching walls, which made me flinch even when he insisted he would never hurt me. The few times he did strike me, he acted as though it was my fault for pushing him. Each bruise became a quiet reminder that keeping him calm had become my responsibility. The psychological control was the final layer and the one that broke me the most. He made me question my worth, my intelligence, my instincts. Over time, I revised my behavior to fit what he expected. I ate when he said to eat, slept when he said it was acceptable, and spoke only when I was certain my voice would not provoke him. I learned to anticipate his moods by the sound of his footsteps in the hallway or the way he closed a door. My body reacted before my mind did, tightening in fear, long before I understood why. Some nights I hid in the bathroom with the door locked, pressing a towel against the crack so the light would not seep out and alert him that I was awake. I sat on the cold tile floor counting my breaths, trying to quiet the tremors in my hands, listening for him to walk past without stopping. Those nights stretched on endlessly, as if time itself paused to give my fear space to expand. I became skilled at disguising my emotions, especially around my mother, who was fighting her own battle against his control. She grew smaller each year, not in size, but in spirit. Her laughter faded piece by piece. She apologized constantly for things that were not her fault. She walked with careful steps as if afraid the floor might shift beneath her. When she started experiencing panic attacks, she brushed them off as stress from work. But I knew better. We both did. The house had become a silent battlefield where our nervous systems remained on high alert day and night. Even moments that should have been peaceful felt strained because peace rarely lasted long. Holidays were the worst because the pressure to maintain a cheerful facade made him quick to anger. Birthdays were performed rituals where he gave gifts controlled by strings of unspoken expectations. I remember one Christmas when he berated my mother for hours because she wrapped his present with the wrong paper. The sound of her quiet sobs that night haunted me for months. By the fourth year, I no longer imagined a life outside that house. Survival had become a routine. Wake up. Avoid triggers. Stay quiet. Keep him calm. Repeat. I lived with the constant awareness that anything could become a reason for him to lash out. A misplaced mug, a forgotten chore, a moment of hesitation, a breath taken at the wrong time. The fifth year felt different in a way I could not name at first. Something in me had begun to crack, not in a way that made me weaker, but in a way that signaled something deep inside was preparing to break free. I was tired of shrinking myself, tired of feeling afraid in my own home. tired of watching my mother wilt under his influence, tired of believing that suffering was the price of keeping peace. The fear did not disappear, but it began competing with something stronger. A small, stubborn spark that whispered, "This cannot be your life forever." That spark would one day become the fire that pushed me to say enough. But during that 5th year, I could not yet imagine escaping because Raymond's control had become its own reality, a world where leaving seemed impossible and surviving felt like the only goal. I had no way of knowing that the next part of my story would begin with one small decision, one brief moment when the spark inside me refused to die and everything I thought I had accepted would finally begin to unravel. The turning point came quietly, not through an explosion of violence or a dramatic confrontation, but through a slow awakening inside me that began on an ordinary Tuesday morning when I stood in the staff break room at the clinic sipping cold coffee and listening to two coworkers talk about their weekend plans. It was nothing special, just a simple conversation about hiking trails and brunch reservations and a flea market one of them wanted to visit. Yet something about the easy way they spoke about their lives made something shift inside me. I realized in that moment how long it had been since I had made plans for myself, real plans that were not shaped by Raymond's rules or his reactions. My world had become so small that even imagining something as simple as a Saturday morning to myself felt almost impossible. On the drive home that day, I caught myself thinking about what my life might look like if I lived alone, free from the constant scrutiny that had shaped every decision I made for the past 5 years. The idea felt forbidden and dangerous, like touching a flame I knew could burn me. But it also felt hopeful in a way nothing had felt hopeful in a long time. When I arrived home, Raymond was sitting at the kitchen table going through the mail, and he barely looked up as I walked in. Yet the moment I saw him, the spark of hope I had felt earlier shrank back inside me like a small animal retreating into a dark corner. That alone told me how deep the damage had become. Still, the thought lingered. The next week I began putting aside small amounts of money each time I was paid. It was not much, but it was enough for me to start browsing rental listings on my phone during lunch breaks. I found a small apartment complex near my job, nothing fancy but clean and safe, and when I saw a studio listed for a price, I could almost afford something inside me whispered that maybe this could be my chance. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine packing my own belongings, choosing my own furniture, drinking tea in a quiet apartment where no footsteps threatened to interrupt my peace. I imagined sleeping without fear. I imagined breathing without thinking about consequences. I imagined waking up in a place where every decision belonged to me. That simple vision filled me with more strength than I expected. When I finally gathered the courage to pick up an application form from the leasing office, I felt a strange mix of pride and fear. My hands trembled as I held the paper, knowing how dangerous it would be if Raymond discovered it. I hid the form beneath my scrubs in my work bag and filled it out in my car during my lunch break the next day, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes as if he might appear out of nowhere. I submitted the application and tried to convince myself I was finally moving forward. But Raymond had a way of sensing even the slightest shift in the household, and within days, he began acting more suspicious than usual. He questioned my schedule, asked why I had been late coming home from work, and demanded to see my text messages because he claimed my behavior seemed secretive. I denied everything as calmly as I could, but the fear in my chest grew heavier. When the leasing office called to say my application had been approved, I stepped outside the clinic to take the call and felt my entire body fill with shaky relief. They offered me a move-in date 2 weeks away. It felt like freedom was finally within reach. But I should have known he would find a way to take it from me. That evening when I arrived home, I noticed my bedroom door slightly open even though I was certain I had closed it that morning. My stomach dropped. My bag sat on my bed unzipped. The application receipt from the leasing office was missing. Raymond came into the doorway a moment later holding the paper between 2 fingers as if it were something filthy. He asked me in a cold, even voice whether I had lost my mind. My mother appeared behind him looking confused and frightened. I tried to explain that I wanted my own place because I was an adult and needed independence, but he cut me off before I could finish. He said that the idea was ridiculous and irresponsible, and that no daughter who respected her mother would abandon the family like that. He told me moving out would make me vulnerable to all kinds of dangers, and that only someone naive and foolish would risk living alone. I stood frozen, unable to decide whether I should defend myself or stay silent. When I tried to reach for the paper, he tore it in half, then again into smaller pieces, letting them fall to the floor at my feet. He said he would not allow me to waste money on a place I did not need, and that any future attempts would be handled accordingly. The next morning, I found that the key to my bedroom had been removed from the lock. Raymond said that privacy had made me secretive, and that from now on, the doors inside the house would remain unlocked at all times. His words were final. That day became the moment when hope and despair collided inside me. I realized how dangerous it was for him to sense even a trace of independence. I also realized something far more important. The fact that he reacted so violently to the idea of me leaving meant that he feared losing control, and that fear of his became the first proof that I was not powerless. I just had not learned how to break free yet. That day marked the real beginning of my escape. The day my mother collapsed is burned into my memory with a sharpness that makes it difficult to breathe even now, because it was the day I finally saw the full cost of the life we had been living under Raymond's control. The day when the consequences of years of fear and pressure became too heavy for her body to carry. It happened on a Sunday afternoon that began like any other deceptively calm and quiet, with soft sunlight drifting through the kitchen windows as my mother chopped vegetables for dinner. I remember thinking she looked tired, more tired than usual, with deep shadows beneath her eyes and a slowness in her movements that made me pause. She brushed it off when I asked if she felt all right, insisting that she was just overworked, that she had not slept well, that it was nothing to worry about. But I had learned to read her expressions as carefully as I had learned to read Raymond's, and something about the tremble in her hands told me that this was not normal exhaustion. Raymond was in the living room watching television, loudly criticizing whatever news segment happened to be playing, and each sharp remark from him made my mother flinch almost imperceptibly. Even when he was not speaking directly to us, the tension in his voice filled the house like smoke impossible to escape. My mother tried to focus on her task, chopping the vegetables into neat pieces the way she always did, but her breaths were shallow and she kept pausing to steady herself against the counter. I stepped closer, intending to insist she sit down, but before I could speak, she pressed a hand to her chest, her face tightening with sudden pain. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. I reached out to catch her as her knees buckled and her body slumped against me with a weight that terrified me. She whispered my name in a voice so faint I almost missed it, and then she lost consciousness completely. Panic surged through me with such force that my vision blurred, but my body moved instinctively as I lowered her to the floor and grabbed my phone to call 911. My hands shook so violently that I nearly dropped it. Raymond appeared in the doorway a moment later, not out of concern but out of irritation, demanding to know what the noise was about. When he saw my mother on the floor, his first reaction was not alarm but confusion, as if he could not understand how something like this could happen without his permission. I ignored him and focused on the dispatcher who guided me through checking her breathing and pulse until the ambulance arrived. Those minutes felt like an eternity. Raymond paced in the background, muttering that she was exaggerating, that she always made things seem worse than they were, that calling an ambulance was unnecessary and expensive. I wanted to scream at him, but fear and adrenaline kept my voice locked in my throat. When the paramedics arrived, they quickly assessed her condition and said she was showing signs of severe stress-induced syncope and dangerously high blood pressure. Hearing those words felt like being hit in the chest because I knew exactly what had caused that level of stress. My mother regained consciousness briefly as they lifted her onto the stretcher, her eyes fluttering open with confusion and fear. She gripped my hand weakly and tried to speak, but the words dissolved before they reached her lips. I promised her I would follow behind the ambulance and that everything would be okay, even though I knew nothing was okay. Nothing had been okay for years. At the hospital, the doctors stabilized her and began running tests. They asked about her medical history, her lifestyle, and any recent sources of extreme stress. Raymond answered for her as much as he could, insisting that our home life was peaceful and that she had simply overworked herself. I stood there staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and rage, wanting more than anything to expose the truth right then and there. But fear still held me captive. When the doctor asked to speak with a family member privately, Raymond followed him out of the room without giving me a chance to volunteer. I stayed by my mother's bedside, holding her hand and watching her chest rise and fall with uneven breaths. I felt guilt settle over me like a heavy blanket because I had known for months that she was deteriorating, that living under Raymond's control was draining the life from her, that she was becoming more withdrawn each day. I had convinced myself that my suffering was the only suffering that mattered, but in that moment I realized she had been breaking quietly long before I even noticed. When the doctor returned, he explained that my mother's condition was the result of prolonged psychological stress combined with chronic sleep deprivation. Hearing those words spoken so plainly by a medical professional made something inside me snap. This was not just emotional strain. This was physical harm. Real harm. Harm that Raymond had caused. After the doctor left the room, I sat beside my mother and whispered that I would get us out, that I would not let him hurt her anymore, that I would find a way, even if it took everything in me. She squeezed my hand with barely any strength, but it was enough to tell me she understood. It was enough to tell me she needed me to do what she could not. Raymond returned a few minutes later with a forced expression of concern, as if he were playing a role he did not fully understand how to perform. He blamed her collapse on faulty hospital equipment and incompetent staff, anything except the truth. I watched him lie so effortlessly that I felt something cold settle inside me. I knew then that staying in that house would eventually kill her, and possibly kill me too. That night as I drove home alone from the hospital, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. The road blurred through tears I refused to let fall. Something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 5 years, the fear inside me was no longer stronger than the determination building beneath it. For the first time, I understood with absolute clarity that if I did not fight for us, no one else ever would. And for the first time, I believed I might actually be capable of escaping him. The night everything finally erupted began, like so many others, with a heaviness in the air that I had grown far too accustomed to a tension that pressed against the walls of the house and settled in my chest long before Raymond ever raised his voice. It had been 3 days since my mother was discharged from the hospital and brought home with instructions to rest, hydrate, avoid stress, and follow up with her primary doctor within the week. I had taken those instructions as seriously as anyone would, but Raymond treated them like inconveniences designed to interfere with his authority. He insisted she did not need medication, that the doctors exaggerated her condition, and that her fainting spell was her own fault for being emotional. I could see my mother shrinking again, retreating into herself the way she always did when he tore down her sense of reality. I tried to protect her, but the resentment building inside me had reached a point where silence felt like suffocation. That afternoon, I returned home from work to find Raymond pacing the living room with restless movements, irritated that dinner was not ready, even though my mother had been instructed to avoid overexertion. She sat at the kitchen table looking pale but determined, insisting she would finish cooking because she did not want to upset him. I begged her to stop telling her she needed to rest, but she shook her head with a defeated expression that broke something in me. When Raymond saw us whispering, he demanded to know what secret conversation we were having behind his back. Before I could respond, he accused me of trying to turn my mother against him and said that I was poisoning the peace of the household. I wanted to scream that there was no peace to poison, that his control had sucked the air out of this home long before I knew how to fight back, but I kept my voice steady for my mother's sake. I told him she needed rest, nothing more. That simple statement of concern was enough to light the fuse. He stepped toward me with that slow, deliberate walk he used when he wanted to intimidate, his expression hard and cold. He said I had become insolent, that ever since my mother had gone to the hospital, I had been acting like this was my house to run. When I tried to explain, he spoke over me, telling me to lower my tone, telling me to mind my place, telling me that I had no right to question him. My heart pounded violently in my chest, but I refused to back down this time. When my mother tried to intervene, he silenced her with a look so sharp it made her close her mouth instantly. That moment stirred a rage in me I had spent years suppressing. I told him he did not get to talk to her like that. He turned toward me with a stare full of contempt and something darker, something that promised pain if I continued pushing. For a second, I felt the old instinct urge me to shrink, to apologize, to diffuse the situation the way I always had. But something inside me had changed. My mother's collapse had awakened a part of me that no longer cared about his rules or his expectations or the consequences of defying him. So when he stepped even closer, close enough that his breath brushed against my cheek, I held my ground. His voice dropped into that low, dangerous tone he used right before a storm. He told me to go to my room, that adults were speaking, that I needed to learn respect. I told him no. The word came out small at first, but the moment I said it, I felt something burn inside me, something that had been buried so deep I almost did not recognize it. His eyes widened slightly at my refusal, and for a brief instant, I saw the flicker of surprise on his face before it twisted into anger. He grabbed my arm, not yet harsh enough to bruise, but firm enough to warn me that he could escalate. My mother gasped and begged him to stop, but he ignored her completely. He told me that if I wanted to act like a child, he would treat me like one. Fear surged through me the way it had countless times over the years, but this time it collided with something stronger, something I could no longer contain. I yanked my arm free and stepped back, my chest heaving, my entire body trembling. Then I heard myself shout the words that had lived inside me for 5 long years, the words that would change everything. "Do not touch me." His face darkened instantly, the way clouds roll in before a violent storm. He moved toward me with a speed I had never seen in him, his hand lifting slightly as if he intended to grab me again, or worse. My mother cried out my name, pleading with him to stop, pleading with me to stay quiet, but neither of us listened. Everything happened at once. Raymond slammed a cabinet door so hard the dishes rattled. He kicked a chair out of his way with enough force to topple it. His anger filled the room with a suffocating pressure that made my heart race so fast I felt dizzy. He accused me of betraying him, of trying to humiliate him, of poisoning the household. Each word felt like shards of glass thrown in my direction. I backed toward the hallway, slowly keeping my eyes on him as he advanced. I told my mother to get her bag and follow me, but she shook her head in a panic, too afraid to move, too conditioned by years of control to consider defiance. Raymond turned his fury on her, then blaming her for my behavior, saying she had made me weak. She shrank into herself like a shadow pulling inward. Seeing that broke whatever restraint I had left. I stepped between them, pushing him back without thinking. It was a small shove, barely enough to move him, but it was the first physical act of defiance I had ever made, and he felt it. His face contorted with rage. He grabbed my wrist, harder this time, enough to make pain shoot up my arm. For a second, I thought he would strike me. For a second, I saw my life narrowing into a single, terrifying point. But something in me snapped fully then. I twisted out of his grip, using all the strength I could gather, turned and ran. I heard my mother call after me, begging me not to leave her, but I knew that if I stayed one more second, something irreparable would happen. I dashed down the hallway and grabbed my purse and keys from the small table near the door. Raymond's footsteps thundered behind me, gaining speed, but adrenaline pushed me faster. I flung the door open and bolted outside the cold night air, hitting my face like a slap. I did not stop running until I reached my car. My hands shook violently as I fumbled with my keys, hearing him shouting my name from the front porch. His voice echoed through the darkness, full of fury and disbelief, but I refused to look back. The moment the engine roared to life, I pulled out of the driveway so fast the tires squealed, tears streaming down my face as the house shrank in my rearview mirror. My entire body trembled uncontrollably, but beneath the fear, there was something else rising, something fierce and unfamiliar. Freedom. For the first time in 5 years, I was not under his roof. For the first time in 5 years, he was not between me and the door. For the first time in 5 years, I felt the possibility of a life that belonged to me. I drove without knowing where I was going, my breaths short and uneven, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing holding me together. but a single truth repeated in my mind with every mile I put between myself and that house. I had finally fought back, and nothing in my life would ever be the same again. I did not stop shaking for the first 10 minutes of my escape, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white as I sped through the dark streets with no destination other than away. Every red light felt like a trap. Every passing pair of headlights made my heart pound with the fear that Raymond might come after me, that he might appear in my rearview mirror with that furious expression I had spent years learning to fear. The night outside blurred past my windows, streetlights smearing into streaks of gold as tears pooled in my eyes, but I kept driving, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and the house that had kept me trapped for 5 years. My breathing was shallow and ragged, and my mind raced with fragmented thoughts that collided into each other so quickly I could barely make sense of them. I thought of my mother alone in that house, terrified. I thought of Raymond's face twisted with anger. I thought of the word I had finally shouted at him, the word that had changed everything. Do not touch me. That word was still ringing in my ears like something alive, something fierce and fragile at the same time. I did not know where else to go, so my instinct led me to the only person I had trusted before my world began collapsing, the only person whose number I had whispered into my phone in secret moments when I felt suffocated. Marissa. We had been friends in high school, the kind of friendship that never fully died, even when life pulled us in different directions. After Raymond came into our lives, I slowly withdrew from everyone, including her, because isolation had become a survival tactic. But she had always told me that if I ever needed anything, anything at all, I could come to her. That promise floated through my mind as I reached the edge of Salem and turned onto the familiar street where she lived. When I pulled into her driveway, my car headlights illuminating the small welcome sign by her porch, my chest tightened with a mixture of relief and humiliation. I hated that I was arriving like this, shaking, terrified, desperate. But the moment I stepped out of the car and heard the soft creak of her screen door opening, all the strength I had been clinging to slipped away. Marissa stood on the porch in a hoodie and pajama shorts, confusion on her face for only a moment before it melted into concern. "Emily," she whispered, stepping closer. "Are you hurt?" Her voice cracked with the kind of worry no one had shown me in years, and something inside me broke open. I collapsed into her arms with a sob I did not recognize as my own. She held me tightly as I trembled uncontrollably, guiding me inside without asking questions, without demanding explanations. She only said, "You're safe now. You're safe." Her apartment smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent, warm and comforting in a way that made me feel both grounded and undone. She sat me on the couch, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and knelt in front of me as if afraid I might disappear if she looked away. "What happened?" she asked gently, her hands steady and warm on mine. The words would not come at first. My throat tightened and my chest heaved as the events of the night replayed in fragments. The shouting, the terror, his hand gripping my wrist, my mother crying my name, the sound of my own voice shouting back at him for the first time. When I finally managed to speak, the story spilled out slowly, shakily, like something being released after years of confinement. I told her about the 5 years of control, the rules, the insults, the fear that had seeped into every corner of my life. I told her about my mother's collapse and the way Raymond dismissed it, how he tore up my rental application, how he removed the lock from my door, how he told me I had no right to decide my own life. I told her about tonight, about the shouting, the threats the moment I ran. When I finished speaking, Marissa's eyes were filled with tears and anger. "Emily," she whispered, "that man is dangerous. You cannot go back there. I know," I said, my voice barely audible. "I do not want to go back. Not ever." She squeezed my hands firmly and said something that would become the next step in my escape. "We need to get you help. Real help." She grabbed her phone, opened a browser, and typed something quickly before turning the screen toward me. "Domestic violence hotline." My stomach clenched at the words. For years, I had avoided thinking of myself as someone living through domestic violence. I thought that label belonged to someone else, someone hurt worse, someone whose bruises showed. I thought emotional terror was somehow not enough to qualify. But as I looked at Marissa's phone, at the number glowing on the screen, I felt the truth settle over me with heartbreaking clarity. I was one of them. I had been one of them for years. And now, I finally had a chance to get out. Marissa sat beside me as I made the call, her hand around mine to steady me. When the hotline advocate answered with a calm, gentle voice, something in me unraveled completely. For the first time in 5 years, I spoke honestly, without fear of judgment, without needing to protect Raymond, without needing to hide the truth. The advocate listened carefully, asked questions with patience, and assured me over and over that leaving was the most dangerous but most important step. She told me I had done the hardest part already. She urged me to stay somewhere safe, to consider filing for a protection order, and to contact the police if Raymond attempted to find me. When the call ended, Marissa wrapped her arms around me again and let me cry into her shoulder. It was the first night in years that I fell asleep without listening for footsteps. The first night, my breathing slowed, not because I forced it to, but because safety wrapped itself around me like a blanket. My escape had only just begun, but for the first time in 5 years, I felt like I was finally living a night that belonged to me. The morning after I fled to Marissa's apartment, I woke up with a pounding headache and a heaviness in my chest that made it difficult to draw a full breath. For a moment, I did not know where I was, and panic jolted through me until I recognized the soft beige walls of her living room and the blanket wrapped around me. The realization that I was safe made my entire body sag with relief, but that relief was quickly followed by a new kind of fear, one I had never allowed myself to feel before. The fear of what came next. Surviving Raymond had required endurance, but escaping him required something far scarier: action. Marissa entered the room with 2 mugs of tea, her expression full of sympathy and determination. She sat beside me and told me gently that we needed to talk about my next steps. I nodded, even though my hands trembled just thinking about it. She asked whether I had told the hotline advocate everything and whether I had considered filing a report. The word report made my stomach twist because reporting him meant acknowledging the full truth of what I had survived. It meant giving up the illusion that things might get better someday. It meant taking control in a way he had spent years teaching me not to. But when I thought about my mother pale and trembling in that hospital bed, something inside me hardened. I knew I had to do this not only for me, but for her too. Marissa offered to drive me to the police station after work, and even though fear coiled inside me like a living thing, I agreed. Those hours leading up to the appointment felt endless. Every small sound outside made me flinch. Every vibration from my phone made my heart race with dread that it might be Raymond. When the clock finally hit 4, I nearly backed out. But Marissa placed her hand on mine and told me I was stronger than I believed. Her certainty gave me just enough courage to follow her to the car. The police station felt colder than I expected. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and floor cleaner. A young female officer approached us and asked how she could help. The moment I opened my mouth to speak, my voice failed me. It had not occurred to me how difficult it would be to say the words out loud, to label my life as abuse, to admit the truth I had buried. But the officer's expression softened with understanding, and she guided me to a small private room with 2 chairs and a box of tissues. She told me to take my time. So I did. The story poured out slowly at first, but once the first crack appeared in the dam, everything rushed through it. I told her about the years of control, the financial manipulation, the tracking of my movements, the punishments, the threats, the intimidation, the physical assaults, even when they were rare enough that the bruises faded fast. I told her about my mother, about her collapse, about Raymond tearing up my rental application and removing the lock from my door. I described the night he grabbed my wrist and the fear that had finally pushed me to run. She listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. There was no judgment in her voice, no disbelief, only quiet empathy mixed with a professional steadiness that made it easier to keep going. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and told me that what I described was domestic violence, plain and simple, and that I had done the right thing by coming in. Hearing the phrase domestic violence spoken with such certainty made my throat tighten. She offered to help me file for a restraining order and encouraged me to visit the county courthouse first thing the next morning. She also asked whether I wanted officers to accompany me if I needed to retrieve belongings from the house. The thought of returning to that place, even with police present, made my pulse spike, but I nodded because I knew I would eventually need my documents, clothes, and the little pieces of my life still trapped there. She also offered to document my injuries, but there were no visible bruises left by then. Still, she insisted that emotional and psychological harm mattered just as much. When the report was finally filed, she gave me a card with her direct number and told me to call if Raymond attempted to contact me. Stepping out of that room felt surreal, as if I had shed a skin I had worn for so long I had forgotten it did not belong to me. Marissa hugged me tightly and told me she was proud of me. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of pride in myself, too. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning on her couch as my mind replayed every moment of the police interview. Fear lingered, but beneath it, there was a steady pulse of something stronger: determination. The next morning, we drove to the courthouse where I filled out the petition for a restraining order describing what had happened in as much detail as my shaking hands allowed. The clerk processed the request and told me a temporary order could be issued within hours. True to her word, by early afternoon, I held the papers in my hands, a legal boundary between me and the man who had controlled my life for half a decade. It was not a guarantee of safety, but it was a beginning. The courthouse staff connected me with a victim's advocate who helped explain my rights and offered resources for counseling, legal support, and emergency funds if needed. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had guided many women through similar situations, and when she said I was not alone, I believed her. Later that evening, an officer accompanied me back to the house so I could collect my belongings. My hands shook as we walked up the driveway. The officer knocked and announced himself, and after a long, tense moment, Raymond opened the door, his expression twisting the moment he saw me. But he could not come near me. He could not raise his voice at me. He could not intimidate me in front of a uniformed officer standing beside me with a copy of the court order in hand. Raymond demanded explanations, shouted accusations, and insisted everything was a misunderstanding, but the officer cut him off each time. I went straight to my room, packed clothes, important documents, and a few sentimental items. My mother stood in the hallway, her eyes glassy, her hands trembling. She whispered my name as if afraid to be overheard. When I hugged her, she clung to me with desperation, whispering that she loved me, whispering that she wished she could leave too. I promised her I would help her once I was safe. When I stepped out of the house for the last time, Raymond shouted after me that I was destroying the family, that I was dramatic, that I was ungrateful. But for the first time, I felt nothing but clarity. I did not owe him pain. I did not owe him silence. I did not owe him my life. The officer escorted me to the car and told me to call if he attempted anything. As I drove away, the house grew smaller in my mirror until it disappeared completely. Something inside me loosened like a chain falling away, link by link. The journey ahead would be long, painful, and complicated, but for the first time in 5 years, I had taken control of my own story. I was no longer surviving. I was beginning to heal, and I knew deep down that this was only the start of my freedom. The final confrontation with Raymond did not come in the explosive, chaotic way I had imagined during the years I spent wishing for escape. Instead, it arrived quietly, abruptly, on a gray Thursday morning when the air outside the hospital parking lot felt heavy and wet, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. I had driven there before sunrise to bring my mother breakfast and sit with her before her follow-up appointment. She had finally found the courage to stay with a coworker for a few days, though she still hesitated to make any permanent decisions. I understood her fear, understood how years of being controlled made every step toward freedom feel like walking through thick fog. I stood beside my car with a paper bag of pastries in one hand and her favorite coffee in the other when I heard footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate. Even before I turned, something in my body recognized the rhythm. A cold vibration shot through my spine. When I faced him, Raymond stood less than 10 feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his jaw tense, his eyes locked on me with a mixture of anger and something darker, something like betrayal. Seeing him outside the environment he controlled made him look smaller than I remembered, but the fear in my chest still flared the way it always had. I forced myself to breathe slowly. He took a step closer and said my name with a tight, controlled tone that made my skin crawl. I asked him how he found me, and he shrugged as if it were obvious. He said he knew my mother had an appointment today and he wanted to talk. The words talk and Raymond did not belong in the same sentence. I took one step back, maintaining distance, reminding myself of the restraining order in my purse. He ignored the space I tried to create. He said everything could still be fixed, that I had overreacted, that I had embarrassed him by involving the police. He said I had humiliated the family. I felt my heart beating wildly against my ribs, but something in me stayed rooted. I told him calmly that nothing could be fixed because nothing had been broken by accident. I told him that everything I did was to survive. His expression twisted into annoyance. He said I was brainwashed by outsiders, that the police had filled my head with nonsense, that Marissa was manipulating me. When I did not respond the way he expected, he moved closer again, his voice lowering into a threatening whisper. He asked why I wanted to destroy him. That question hit me like cold water, not because of its words, but because of how sincerely he believed them. Raymond had spent so many years rewriting reality that he truly saw himself as the victim. I told him again that he needed to step back. Instead, he took another step forward and hissed that I was ungrateful, selfish, cruel, and that my mother would suffer without him. Something inside me snapped. For the first time in my life, I cut him off mid-sentence. I told him in a clear, steady voice that he would not speak about my mother again, that he would not speak to me again, that I did not owe him a single breath of explanation. He stared at me startled, as if he had never imagined a world where I spoke to him without fear. Then his anger surged. His face flushed, his fists clenched. He took a final step toward me close enough that I felt the heat of his rage. He said I needed to come with him now, that he would not ask again, that I belonged at home. My breath caught in my throat, but this time the fear did not control me. This time I remembered the restraining order. I remembered the officer who had told me I had rights. I remembered my mother's pale face in the hospital bed, and I remembered the night I ran. So I reached into my bag, slowly, deliberately, keeping my eyes on him. He leaned forward slightly, as if ready to grab my wrist the moment I hesitated. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency police number I had been told to call if he tried to approach me. He scoffed, called me dramatic, said I was bluffing. I told the dispatcher my name, location, and that a restrained individual was attempting to confront me. When Raymond heard the word restrained, his eyes widened, a flicker of fear breaking through his fury. He told me to hang up, to stop embarrassing myself, to stop overreacting. I did not say another word. I just kept the phone pressed to my ear. The dispatcher told me to stay still and that an officer was already close by. Raymond looked around the parking lot, suddenly aware of how many people were around us. A nurse walking to her car slowed down. A man loading boxes into a truck glanced our way. Witnesses. Something he could not control. He hissed my name again, quieter now, more frantic. He said we could talk somewhere private. I shook my head. I told him he needed to leave. He took another step toward me, his hand rising slightly as if he wanted to grab my arm and drag me away. But before he could touch me, red and blue lights reflected across the glass doors of the hospital entrance. A patrol car pulled into the lot with a slow, deliberate movement that made Raymond freeze. 2 officers stepped out, one hand resting near his holster, the other holding a clipboard. They approached with confident strides and asked him to identify himself. Raymond tried to regain composure, insisting everything was a misunderstanding, that he had come to check on his wife and stepdaughter, that I was emotional, confused, unstable. But the officers had already been informed about the restraining order. They told him to step aside. He hesitated, eyes darting between them and me, and for the first time I saw fear in him. Real fear. One officer repeated the command. Raymond protested, raising his voice. That was enough. Within seconds, they moved, grabbing his arms, twisting them behind his back in one fluid motion. Raymond shouted, demanding they let go, calling the officers names, saying they had no right, but they ignored him. They snapped handcuffs around his wrists and began reading his rights in the slow, steady tone I had heard only in movies. People in the parking lot stopped to watch. A pair of nurses stood near the entrance, whispering to each other. A doctor paused mid-step. And in that moment, Raymond Hale, The man who had controlled my life for 5 years stood there handcuffed, furious, powerless. The sight of him restrained in public did something to my chest that I had never felt before. Relief, vindication, strength. For years, I had imagined what justice might look like, and nothing had ever matched the real moment of watching him taken away from me, taken away from my mother, taken away from the life he had eaten piece by piece. One of the officers approached me and asked if I was okay. I nodded, though my legs shook beneath me. He confirmed that Raymond was being taken in for violating the restraining order and that I had done exactly what I was supposed to do. I thanked him with a voice barely above a whisper. As the patrol car pulled away, Raymond shouting through the cracked window, I felt something inside me break open, not in pain, but in freedom. For the first time in 5 years, he was not a shadow following me. He was not a voice in my head. He was not a threat waiting in the next room. He was gone. And I was still standing. In the days following Raymond's arrest, I expected to feel nothing but relief, as if freedom would wash over me the moment he was taken away in handcuffs. But instead, I found myself drifting through a fog of conflicting emotions, so heavy and disorienting that I barely recognized the person living inside my own skin. The rational part of me knew I should celebrate the victory, knew I had survived something horrific, and had taken steps toward reclaiming my life. Yet each morning I woke up with my heart pounding, my breath shallow, and a sense of dread curling at the edges of my thoughts as if he might reappear behind me at any moment. Trauma does not dissolve just because the source is removed. It lingers, seeps into the spaces that used to feel safe. That realization hit me hardest the first night I slept at Marissa's after the confrontation. She had given me her bedroom while she took the couch, insisting I needed the comfort of a door I could close. But when I lay down in the dark, the quiet only amplified the sound of my own heartbeat. Every creak in the hallway made my muscles tense. Every passing car threw a flash of light across the wall that sent my breath stumbling. I kept expecting footsteps, the sharp snap of a door opening, the low thunder of Raymond's angry voice rising from somewhere inside the house. Even though I knew logically he was in a holding cell miles away, fear remained a living creature in my body, refusing to be reasoned with. Sleep did not come. Not fully. It came in pieces, in broken fragments that ended with me jolting awake, drenched in sweat. Marissa found me sitting on the edge of the bed at sunrise, trembling, my hands wrapped tightly around my own arms. She sat beside me and didn't ask questions, just waited until my breathing steadied. She told me healing would take time. I wanted to believe her, but I felt like a vase that had been shattered and glued back together, fragile in places I couldn't see the cracks still visible beneath the surface. Over the next week, I tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. I returned to work at the clinic, though everything felt different. Co-workers offered supportive smiles, and my supervisor told me to take as much time as I needed, but even kindness felt overwhelming. I found myself flinching when someone approached too quickly, apologizing excessively whenever I made a small mistake, constantly scanning the front windows for signs of danger. My nervous system had spent years living in survival mode, and shifting out of that state felt like learning how to breathe all over again. The sound of raised voices in the waiting room made my stomach tighten. The slam of a supply cabinet made my whole body jerk. Once, when a patient accidentally dropped a metal tray, I felt my knees buckle as if bracing for an impact that wasn't coming. It was humiliating to feel so fragile, but the therapist I began seeing through a victims advocacy program told me it was normal. She explained that trauma rewires the brain, makes it interpret harmless sounds, as threats makes the past feel like the present. She said healing meant teaching my body that the danger was gone, but that the process would be slow, patient, deliberate. I started therapy twice a week, sitting in a softly lit room where I learned to unravel years of fear. The first sessions left me emotionally drained, sometimes sobbing for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. Other days, I felt numb, as if I had run out of tears. The therapist gently helped me name the things I had lived through: coercive control, psychological abuse, physical intimidation, trauma bonding. Hearing those terms applied to my life felt both validating and devastating. It meant acknowledging that what I survived was real, that I hadn't imagined the terror, that the scars inside me were justified. but understanding the truth also made the weight of everything settle more heavily on my shoulders. I couldn't simply move on. I had to rebuild. Meanwhile, my mother's situation remained complicated. She stayed with a coworker but remained emotionally entangled with Raymond in ways I struggled to understand. Years of manipulation had worn her down, and she alternated between thanking me for taking action and worrying that I had gone too far. She cried often, apologizing for not protecting me, apologizing for not leaving earlier, apologizing for things that were never her fault. I tried to reassure her, but watching her struggle broke my heart in ways I wasn't prepared for. She was a victim too, one who had been controlled for so long that freedom felt frightening. I offered to help her talk to a counselor, and she agreed hesitantly. Progress with her was slow but visible. She laughed a little more. She sat straighter. She spoke without waiting for permission. These small changes made me believe that healing, though painful, was possible for both of us. Still, not everything improved at once. Some nights, I relived memories in vivid detail. The sound of Raymond's voice, the sting of his grip on my wrist. The nights I hid in the bathroom pressing a towel against the door to hide the light. The way he towered over my mother. The way he tore up my rental application. Each flashback left me shaking, and even after the restraining order, fear followed me like a shadow. Every time my phone buzzed, I feared it was him somehow finding a way to reach me. Every time I walked to my car after work, I checked behind me twice. My world felt safer, but not yet safe. The justice system moved slowly. Raymond was charged with violating the restraining order, but court dates were months away. The uncertainty gnawed at me. What would he do when he was released? Would he try to find me? Would he try to contact my mother? My therapist reminded me that fear of retaliation is common among survivors, that the unknown often feels more terrifying than the abuse itself. She taught me grounding techniques for when anxiety overwhelmed me. She told me to breathe into the moments my mind tried to drag me backward. Slowly, inch by inch, I regained pieces of myself. I got a new phone number. I found a small studio apartment on the other side of town, the same complex I had once dreamed of living in before Raymond destroyed my application. Signing the lease felt like reclaiming a part of my soul. The first night I slept there, I cried not from fear, but from the quiet. True quiet. Not the suffocating stillness of waiting for footsteps, but the peaceful kind that comes from being alone in a space that belongs entirely to you. A space without yelling, without tension, without control. I stood in the middle of the room and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket. Even though I was still healing, even though the damage remained, even though nightmares still woke me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not fragile hope. Not desperate hope. Real hope. The kind that comes from surviving. Healing was not a straight line. I learned that quickly, sometimes painfully, as the weeks turned into months, and I tried to rebuild a life that felt truly mine for the first time since Raymond entered our home. In my new apartment, I started with the smallest rituals, things most people never think twice about. Drinking coffee alone in the morning without listening for heavy footsteps in the hallway. Leaving my bathroom door open as I brushed my teeth because I no longer needed to barricade myself inside for safety. Reading a book at night without constantly checking the window blinds. These small freedoms felt surreal at first, like I was borrowing someone else's life. I would sit on my couch and simply breathe, listening to the hum of quiet that replaced years of tension. But healing was unpredictable too. Some mornings I woke up feeling strong, determined to build something new. Other days I was swallowed by emotions that came out of nowhere, moments when I curled on the floor, fighting waves of panic because the memory of Raymond's voice suddenly clawed its way back into my mind. My therapist told me that the body remembers even when the mind tries to move forward. She taught me grounding techniques that sounded simple, but saved me more times than I can count. Press your feet into the floor. Name 5 things you can see. Breathe slow, as if convincing your body that danger isn't breathing down your neck. Over time, these exercises became less like emergency tools and more like quiet acts of reclaiming my autonomy. One afternoon about a month after moving into my apartment, I stood in the produce aisle at the grocery store when a man behind me dropped a jar. The glass shattered loudly, exploding into sound. I froze. My chest tightened like it was being crushed. For a second, I wasn't in the store anymore. I was 22 again, flinching as Raymond slammed a cabinet door because dinner wasn't warm enough when he came home. It took everything in me not to run. But instead of falling apart, I whispered the grounding steps under my breath. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear. Slowly, my breathing steadied. A stranger placed a gentle hand near my shoulder and asked if I was all right. I hadn't realized I was shaking. I nodded, managing a small smile, but inside, something shifted. I wasn't failing. I was healing. Healing does not mean never being triggered. It means learning how to come back from those moments. Another major step was reconnecting with my mother in a healthier way. She moved into a small rental house across town, close enough that we could see each other weekly, but far enough from Raymond's influence that she could breathe again. At first, our conversations felt fragile, like stepping across ice that might crack beneath us. She apologized constantly. I told her she didn't have to, but one evening over dinner, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm learning too, sweetheart. I'm learning what I should have seen earlier. I'm learning how to forgive myself." Hearing that felt like a knot had loosened somewhere deep in my chest. We both carried guilt that wasn't ours. Guilt etched into us by a man who thrived on feeding our insecurities. Letting go of that guilt was part of breaking the cycle. My therapist introduced me to something called cognitive reframing. She said healing was not just about identifying the trauma, but rewriting the beliefs it created. For years, I had believed Raymond's words when he said I was weak, naive, ungrateful, dramatic. Trauma had a way of turning lies into internal truths. So in therapy, we broke those beliefs apart one by one. I practiced saying things out loud that once felt impossible. I am strong. I am capable. I survived. I deserve safety. At first, the words stuck in my throat unfamiliar and uncomfortable, but slowly they began to feel real. The therapist also encouraged me to explore activities that made me feel grounded and connected to myself again. I started with simple things. Taking long walks through a nearby park where the sound of leaves rustling somehow soothed my nerves. Planting small succulents in my apartment window. Cooking meals without worrying if someone was about to criticize me for not seasoning something correctly. I also joined a support group for survivors of domestic violence. The first time I walked into the community center, my stomach twisted in knots. I expected judgment or pity. Instead, I found women of all ages sitting in a circle, their faces tired but determined. When the counselor invited me to speak, my voice trembled so much I could barely get the words out. I told them about Raymond, about the 5 years of control, about the night I finally fought back. I told them about the nightmares and the panic, the guilt and the doubt. When I finished, the woman next to me reached out and squeezed my hand. "You're safe now," she said. Just 3 simple words, but they felt like a lifeline. Over time, the support group became a place where I learned the most important lesson of my healing journey. I was not alone. My experiences were not isolated. Abuse thrives in secrecy and silence. Healing thrives in community and truth. That realization fueled a new part of my recovery. I began journaling every night, spilling thoughts I had buried for years. Sometimes the entries were angry, sometimes sad, sometimes hopeful, but they were mine. Eventually, I realized how far I had come when I returned to the clinic after a day of training new hygienists and found myself laughing with coworkers in the break room. Not a forced laugh, not a laugh used to mask anxiety, a genuine laugh. It startled me at first. But then I realized it was the sound of someone stepping into her life again. Healing also meant facing court. The prosecutor prepared me for what to expect. I worried that seeing Raymond again would unravel everything, but I wasn't the same woman I had been when he controlled every corner of my world. I was different now, stronger, supported, ready. And when the day came, I walked into that courthouse with my therapist beside me and my mother holding my hand. Even though fear trembled under my skin, I kept walking, because healing is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep moving despite it. Little by little, piece by piece, I was rebuilding myself. I was learning to feel safe in my body again. I was learning to trust my voice. I was learning to breathe without apologizing for taking up space. And for the first time in years, I believed in the possibility of a future where pain was not my constant companion. A future I was finally ready to create. 6 months passed in a way that felt both impossibly slow and shockingly fast, like healing moved on two separate timelines that refused to align with each other. On the outside, my life looked stable in ways it had not been for years. I had settled fully into my small studio apartment, decorating it piece by piece with items that reflected who I was rather than who I had been forced to become. A soft blue blanket draped over the couch, a framed print of the Oregon coast above my bed, a small bookshelf filled with novels I had never been allowed to read because Raymond insisted fiction was a waste of time. Each edition felt like reclaiming a part of myself he tried to erase. My routines became more grounded. I woke early, brewed coffee while listening to quiet morning radio stretched by the window as sunlight spilled across the floor. I walked to work some days, taking a longer route just to feel the crisp air fill my lungs. And at the clinic, I moved with a confidence that surprised even me. I trained 2 new hygienists, handled difficult patients without freezing, and even began assisting with community health events. My supervisor told me she saw leadership potential in me, words that would have once terrified me, but now made something warm bloom in my chest. Still healing was layered. Some nights I woke with my heart hammering as if I had been running. Some afternoons, a loud voice in the hallway made my body tense involuntarily. But instead of collapsing under the weight of those moments, I learned to meet them with patience. My therapist called it post-trauma growth, the slow and steady strengthening of the self after surviving something designed to break it. I felt it most clearly one Saturday morning when I visited my mother at her rental house. She greeted me at the door wearing a soft cardigan, her hair pulled back, her eyes brighter than I had seen in years. The house smelled of cinnamon tea and music played gently from a small speaker. She looked healthier, lighter, as if a physical burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. We sat on her porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea while the autumn breeze rustled through the trees. She told me about her counseling sessions, how she was finally learning to name the years of manipulation she endured. She admitted how deeply she regretted not seeing Raymond's true nature sooner, but she also acknowledged for the first time that none of it was her fault. Hearing her say that made my throat tighten. I told her I was proud of her. She squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me too. Sometimes the simplest words carry the greatest healing power. Our relationship, once strained and shaped by fear, had become softer, more honest. We were not the same people we had been before Raymond, but we were learning to meet each other again with compassion rather than shame. I also continued attending the survivor support group. The women there had become a kind of family, a circle of strength formed through shared pain and shared resilience. We celebrated each other's victories, from securing new jobs to finishing therapy milestones to sleeping through the night for the first time in years. During one meeting, I realized it had been weeks since I last felt the urge to look over my shoulder walking to my car. That realization felt like a victory I had never imagined possible. I started taking small steps toward joy, too. I signed up for a watercolor class at a local community center. My hands shook the first time I dipped the brush into paint, but soon the colors flowing across the paper felt calming, like allowing myself to play again. I also adopted a rescue cat from the shelter, a gray tabby named Willow, who loved curling up beside me as I read in the evenings. Her presence settled me in ways I never anticipated. There was something profoundly healing about caring for a creature who had also known hardship but still purred with trust. As the months passed, a new sense of normal began to form. On my days off, I explored farmers markets, visited bookstores, and took long drives along the Willamette River. I reconnected with a few old friends who had quietly reached out after hearing what I had been through. At first, I worried they would see me differently, but they treated me with nothing but kindness. It reminded me that isolation had been one of Raymond's weapons, and breaking that isolation was one of my greatest acts of defiance. Court proceedings continued in the background. Raymond remained incarcerated on multiple charges, and though the legal updates still triggered anxiety, they no longer consumed me. The distance created space for healing, and one crisp November evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, I realized something I never expected to feel. Peace. Not fleeting peace, not momentary calm, but a steady, gentle warmth that settled deep inside me. I thought about the woman I had been 6 months ago, trembling in Marissa's spare bedroom, terrified of the future, unsure if I would ever feel safe again. And then I thought about the woman I was now standing on her own balcony, holding a warm mug of tea, her cat brushing against her leg, her life unfolding with hope rather than fear. Healing had not erased the past, but it had transformed the present. I still carried scars, but they no longer defined me. I no longer felt like a victim trying to survive. I felt like a survivor learning how to live. And for the first time in years, I could see a future that belonged entirely to me. The emotional ending of my story did not arrive with fireworks or fanfare. It came quietly, almost gently, in a moment so ordinary that it took me by surprise. It was a Sunday morning in early December, 6 months after Raymond's arrest, when the air outside was crisp enough to fog the windows of my apartment. I brewed a cup of coffee and stood by the window while Willow curled around my ankles, purring softly. The world felt still, and for the first time since I was a teenager, I felt truly present in my own life. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about everything that had happened, the 5 years of control, the night I finally screamed the word enough, the police lights flashing in the parking lot as Raymond was led away in handcuffs, the therapy sessions, the panic attacks, the rebuilding of my identity, and the unexpected peace that had started to grow in the quiet spaces between those moments. Healing did not erase what had been done to me, but healing allowed me to reclaim the parts of myself that he had tried to take. That morning, as sunlight spread across the hardwood floor, I picked up my journal and wrote something I had never written before. I am proud of myself. Those 5 words sat on the page like a revelation. They did not feel forced. They did not feel like something I was trying to convince myself to believe. They felt true, completely, undeniably true. Later that afternoon, I drove across town to see my mother. She greeted me with a warm hug and invited me inside, the smell of baked apples filling her small kitchen. She looked healthier than I had ever seen her eyes clearer, her posture straighter. We sat at her dining table, a simple wooden piece she had bought secondhand, but considered a symbol of her new beginning. As we talked about her week and mine, she suddenly reached across the table and held my hand. "I'm sorry for everything you had to go through," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I should have protected you." I shook my head gently. We were both trapped, Mom. He isolated us. He controlled everything. We survived together. She squeezed my hand, and in that moment I felt a deep, powerful understanding pass between us. We were not 2 women broken by the same man. We were 2 survivors choosing to rebuild side by side. That shared resilience became part of my emotional closure. But another piece came unexpectedly 1 week later when I received a letter from the district attorney's office confirming Raymond's sentencing. 5 years in state prison for domestic intimidation, coercive control assault, and violating the restraining order. 5 years. The same amount of time he controlled my life. When I read the words, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel rage. I felt release. Not because his prison time erased the past, not because punishment could somehow balance the scales, but because accountability meant I no longer had to carry the weight of proving what he had done. The system had seen him. The law had named his actions, and I could finally step forward without the shadow of his denial following me. That night, I sat on my couch with Willow asleep beside me, my phone buzzing with messages from Marissa and others who had supported me through the hardest moments. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the reality sink in. I was free, truly free. And with that freedom came something I never expected to feel again. Hope. Not fragile hope, not cautious hope, but a deep, rooted hope that allowed me to imagine a future bigger than survival. I imagined traveling again, something I had always loved as a teenager. I imagined going back to school one day, maybe becoming a dental instructor. I imagined laughing loudly without fear. I imagined trusting someone enough to let them into my life again, though I wasn't ready yet. But I could imagine it, and that alone felt like a miracle. A few nights later, I took a long walk through Riverfront Park. The lights along the paths twinkled against the dark sky, and the sound of the Willamette River rushing gently beside me brought a sense of calm I had never thought possible. As I walked bundled in my coat with my breath visible in the cold air, I realized that the emotional ending of my story wasn't about Raymond at all. It wasn't even about what he had done to me. It was about who I had become because I chose to stand up, because I chose myself, because I survived. I stopped on the footbridge overlooking the water, leaned on the railing, and let the cool wind brush against my face. My heart felt steady, my body felt grounded, my soul felt mine again, and I whispered into the quiet night not for anyone else to hear, but for myself. I made it. The words floated out into the cold air and disappeared, but their truth settled inside me like a warm ember. I made it. I was still standing, and I was finally alive in a way I hadn't been in years. That was my emotional ending. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet reclaiming of my life. A life that belonged only to me. If you have followed my journey all the way to this moment, then maybe you see pieces of yourself in my story. Pieces you have carried quietly for years. Pieces you thought no one would ever understand. And I want you to hear me clearly because this part is not just about my life anymore. It is about yours. Healing is slow, messy, painful, sometimes excruciating and often hidden behind closed doors where no one else can see the weight you carry. But every small step you take matters more than you realize. If you are living in fear today, or if you lived in fear years ago and still feel the echoes of that fear in your bones, you are not weak, you are not dramatic, you are not broken beyond repair. You survived something you never should have had to survive, and survival is not a sign of weakness. It is proof of strength that many people will never understand. I hope my story reminds you that truth spoken at the right moment can change everything. Maybe your moment has not come yet, or maybe it came and you are still learning how to breathe afterward, but either way, you deserve compassion, you deserve safety, you deserve the chance to rebuild a life that belongs only to you. If you are still trapped in a situation that feels impossible to escape, please hear me when I say that the world outside that pain is bigger than you think. You may not see it now. I didn't either. For 5 long years, I believed I had no choices, no voice, and no power left inside me. But the truth is that courage does not always start with a scream. Sometimes courage begins with a whisper, a trembling breath, a quiet decision to tell just one person what has been happening behind those closed doors. Sometimes courage begins with the simple thought that you deserve better, even if you cannot act on it yet. And if you have already escaped, if you are already standing in the aftershocks with your heart still shaking and your mind still replaying the past, I want you to know that healing does not follow a schedule. You do not owe the world a quick recovery. Every tremor of fear, every night you wake up reaching for safety, every tear that comes out of nowhere is part of the process. There is no shame in needing help. There is no shame in falling apart after the danger is gone. There is no shame in learning to rebuild a life at your own pace. The scars that remain are not signs of failure. They are reminders of how hard you fought to survive. And if my story made you feel seen in any way, please tell me where you are watching from and how far along your healing journey you are. Your story matters too. Your voice matters too. Share your experience in the comments if you feel safe to do so, because you never know who needs to hear that they are not alone. Someone out there might be taking their first brave breath after years of silence, and your words could be the light they cling to. And if this story touched you, if it made you feel something deep inside your chest, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you used to be, please like this video so more people can find it and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories like this. These stories are not just entertainment for many of us, they are lifelines, reminders that even in the darkest moments, there is a way forward. And if you or someone you care about is dealing with domestic violence, please consider reaching out to a hotline, an advocate, a counselor, or even a trusted friend. The path out is rarely easy, but it always begins with a single step. I hope today is the day you find the courage to take yours. Thank you for listening to my journey, for staying with me through each painful memory and every fragile victory. Telling this story was not easy. Reliving these moments was not easy. But healing grows stronger when truth is spoken, and maybe my truth will help you speak yours. Remember this even if you forget everything else I have said. You are worthy of peace. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of a life free from fear. And no matter how long it takes, no matter how many steps backward you might take before moving forward again, you can heal. You can rise. You can reclaim your life just like I did. And if you need a place to feel understood, you are always welcome here. If you are still here with me at the end of this story, I want to speak directly to the part of you that stayed, the part that understands pain, that lingers long after the bruises fade, the part that recognizes the quiet fear of being controlled or diminished, the part that maybe has lived through something similar or knows someone who has. I want you to take a moment and really breathe, because you deserve to feel safe even while listening to someone else's survival. And if hearing my journey stirred something inside you, whether it was anger, sadness, relief, or even a memory you thought you had buried, please know that your feelings are valid. You are allowed to feel everything that rises to the surface. You are allowed to name it. You are allowed to release it. Stories like mine are not just entertainment. For many people, they are a mirror that reflects both their suffering and their strength. And if this story reminded you of something in your own past or present, I hope you do not carry it alone. If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us how far you are on your healing journey. Tell us what part of this story hit you the hardest. Your words may help someone else take their first step. If commenting feels too vulnerable, that is okay. Simply knowing you are here listening and healing in your own way is powerful enough. And if you or someone you care about is living through control, intimidation, or any form of abuse, please consider reaching out to a hotline, a counselor, or someone you trust. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of clarity and courage. I wish someone had told me that years ago. If this story gave you even a small moment of comfort or strength, please like the video so more survivors can find it. And if you want to hear more real stories of resilience, more stories that speak honestly about pain healing and the complicated journey of rebuilding, consider subscribing to the channel. Every story shared here is crafted with care, with truth, and with the hope of reaching someone who needs to hear it at exactly the right moment. And before you go, I want you to remember one thing. You deserve peace. Not someday. Not if everything goes right. Not only if you earn it. You deserve peace because you are human, because you have survived, because you have endured more than most people will ever know. Let this be the beginning of something gentle inside you. The beginning of a softer chapter where your heart is allowed to rest, where your voice is allowed to be heard, and where your story is allowed to matter. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for choosing healing in whatever form it takes for you today.